Welcome, everyone, and thank you for standing by. I would like to advise you that today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. All participants will be in listen-only mode until the question and answer session of today's call. I would now like to turn the conference over to Erlene Dowell. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to Greg Pewitt from the Census Bureau for hosting our webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our June LED webinar. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the Local Employment Dynamics Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome back our presenter and my former colleague, Mark Kutzbach, as he presents Storms and Jobs, the Effects of Hurricanes on Individuals' Employment and Earnings Over the Long Term. Hurricanes Katrina and Rita devastated the U.S. Gulf Coast in 2005. This presentation examines effects on the earnings of the affected workers over the short and long term using job-level data to compare the evolution of earnings for affected workers in 4 states with workers from match control counties. Short-term earning losses are attributed to job separations and long-term gains to wage growth in the affected areas. Wages rose due to reduced labor supply and increased labor demand in the affected labor market. Demand to a worker's residence or workplace accentuated short-term earnings losses. Effects varied by preterm industry with larger gains for workers in sectors related to rebuilding. Mark Kutzbach is a senior financial economist at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in the Center for Financial Research. His research interests include banking, consumer finance, urban, labor, and transportation economics, as well as data linkage and confidentiality protection. Mark has contributed to the How America Banks report, which presents findings from the FDIC survey of household use of banking and financial services, a topical supplement to the current population survey. He joined the FDIC in April 2017 after working at the U.S. Census Bureau's Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics Research Group of the Center for Economic Studies since 2009. He obtained his PhD in economics from the University of California, Irvine, and his BS in economics with a minor in history from the Northwestern University. With that, I will turn it over to Mark.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Erlene. Erlene helped me to time the date of this webinar to be right at the start of hurricane season, which will go all the way through November or whenever hurricanes end this year. We certainly hope that it's a mild season. Analysis of disasters often uses local economic data to understand what's happening at the time of the disaster and the effects of the disaster. The Census Bureau has developed a lot of these data sets, including one from some of the data that I'll be using today. There's an application on the Map for Emergency Management that tracks hurricanes and other disasters in real time for the analysis of economic impacts. The analysis I'll be reporting on today goes beyond what's often possible in that kind of local geographic economic data, in that it will track individuals over the long term. So we'll have a set of individuals that are affected by these storms in 2005, and we'll look at their employment outcomes years later. And that's usually not something that's possible with local economic data in the way that it's published, but we think it gives some insights into what's happening and what you might see when you're looking at that local economic data. My co-authors are Jeffrey Groen and Ann Polivka at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I'm at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So the disclaimer here is that these are the authors' views, not those of BLS, the FDIC, the U.S. Census Bureau, or the United States. Much of this work was done while I was employee of the U.S. Census Bureau, and these results have been reviewed for confidentiality. protection. So how did this paper come to be? I was an economist at the Census Bureau in the LEHD research group, also working with the loads data, and I presented on one of my research papers at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There I met Jeffrey Groen and Ann Polivka, who had a lot of knowledge of hurricanes and disaster effects from their previous research. And we thought up a collaboration to use some of the data at the Census Bureau as well as some BLS data for this analysis. So I'll be going over, I'll start with an introduction, kind of setting the stage of the specific disasters that we'll be looking at. Then I'll go over the data that we used and how we divided up our sample into those who were treated or, most directly affected by the storms, and a control group that we think is pretty similar that was not directly affected by the storms. Then I'll go over our empirical methodology, our estimation results, and our analysis of local labor market dynamics. So this analysis uses impacts from two hurricanes in 2005, Katrina and Rita. They were very close together in timing, and so it's not really possible to look at one without looking at the other. Katrina hit in August of 2005. Rita was in September. Katrina was in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, caused over 1,000 deaths, flooded New Orleans, had a substantial storm surge on the Gulf Coast, and resulted in 1.5 million evacuees, many of whom ended up being pretty long-term evacuees. Rita was hit the shore a little bit to the west of Katrina on the Texas-Louisiana border, and did substantial wind and flooding damage along coastal areas. So we'll be looking at storm damage across a 4-state area from both of those effects. So needless to say, these storms were a massive tragedy for those involved and had long-lasting effects. So just as a kind of a high-level look at like one of those local economic effects, this is from the data pulled from the quarterly workforce indicators of the U.S. Census Bureau, looking at employment, new hires, and separations on a quarterly basis for New Orleans Parish. So the horizontal axis is showing the quarters, and you can see there is a big peak in separations right in 2005, quarter 3. So that's workers who were employed at the beginning of that quarter, in the beginning of July, and then lost their job in that quarter. And then by the next quarter, there is a significant drop in employment, and that starts to recover over a number of years, but doesn't fully recover, even within 4 years. So a lot of our analysis is going to be driven by some anticipated effects. We'll kind of divide those up into effects in the immediate aftermath and short-term disruptions, as well as kind of medium and longer-term effects. So, immediately we anticipate residents and employers are going to be very busy cleaning up, rebuilding. There's infrastructure damage, vehicle damage, and that's going to prevent people from working. Rather than working, evacuees are spending a lot of time finding temporary housing, obtaining aid, and dealing with dislocation from their homes. In the medium and longer term, local labor market dynamics will depend on shifts in labor supply and labor demand. And so the effects on workers' earnings and employment are a little more ambiguous ex ante, because we don't know exactly how the labor supply and labor demand shifts are going to turn out. And So I'll get into this a lot more later, but we think there might be some different effects in the construction industry, where we expect a lot of demand, in industries that depend on local population and tourism. We'll call those non-tradable industries like retail, education. And then in tradable industries like manufacturing or say like the oil industry, where they're selling a product abroad, and so demand is really outside of the local area. So our main contributions are that we're following individuals rather than local areas, and that'll be possible through the LEHD data at the Census Bureau. And it's really relevant because a lot of disaster aid is actually targeted towards individuals and households as opposed to locations. So we'll estimate short and long-term effects on labor market outcomes, and then we'll also look at outcomes across a wide range of person-level characteristics, like the industry they were in, how damaged their home location was, demographics. Some of these turn out to be, having wide-ranging differences in effects across populations. So getting into the data, we are going to define our treatment area, like the set of counties that we think are most directly affected, using information compiled by HUD from the Housing and Urban Development Agency Department on the share of housing units in a county that were severely damaged. So this will range from a few percent all the way up to over 40% in some counties were severely damaged. And any of these counties that had some substantial amount of damage, we're going to say that there are probably some local economic impacts there, and we're going to be concerned with looking at the effects on people who lived there just before the storm hit. We're also going to try and see exactly where the damage is in some of those counties. So FEMA at the time of the storm used some remote sensing data with follow-up analysis, and defined specific types of damage at different geographic locations at a very detailed level. We've classified these as locations with major damage, locations with minor damage, and locations where damage was not reported. So here you can see on the left is a satellite image of the New Orleans area right after the storms. A lot of flooding in New Orleans. You can kind of see a dark area on the map, and that corresponds pretty closely to this data from FEMA. The red areas on the map to the right correspond to that. So that's some of the most severely affected locations. We'll be looking at people whose residences and workplaces were in those locations. So now I've added onto this map these little rectangles, which are actually census blocks, often corresponding to city blocks in an urban area. And we'll actually, map the households and workplaces that are in those locations to those levels of damage, so we can get an idea of, what kind of damage those households and businesses are facing. In another area with, different kinds of effects, in Mississippi, there was a large storm surge, which was different from the flooding in New Orleans, and that had severe effects, especially right along the coastal areas. A lot of rain and wind damage further inland. Let's see. So now I'm going to talk about how we brought all the data together for this. So we start out with household surveys, which track households responding to the 2000 census and the American Community Survey. And we link those with person IDs to earnings records, or rather with, identifying information that the Census Bureau keeps track of with those records to earnings records. and so there's about 130 million jobs maintained in the LEHD database at one point, and those are also matched to employer account data for about 7 million employers at a time. And so that's how we're getting from households who are responding to a survey to earnings records. Now, we're going to limit the analysis to persons aged 25 to 59 in 2005 and those who were actually employed at the time of the storm. Then we'll also use identifying information to link to place of residence in 2005. And we also have a workplace location for employers in 2005. And then the last step will be to link both of those to this detailed damage data. So this is a map of the most affected counties, which are in that red rectangle. There's 63 counties there in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And we're going to be comparing households there with a set of counties that we think are fairly comparable to those counties in terms of demographics and local economic characteristics. So, we know that that Gulf Coast area is fairly unique in a lot of characteristics, and no part of the country is exactly the same as it, but we think collectively this set of counties is somewhat similar. Some areas having similar industries, some areas having especially similar demographics. And so you can see that here. This is just showing a few characteristics. First, race, ethnicity. There's a similar share of the population is, for example, Black, not Hispanic in the treatment and control areas, about 27% in each of those. In industry, the treatment area is about 12.7% manufacturing. The control is 13.8% manufacturing. And the unemployment rates were similar as well. So, not every characteristic matches perfectly, but the goal of this is just to try and have a population that we think would have been as similar to this treated group as possible had the storms not occurred at that time. And we'll kind of use that as the baseline to measure effects for the treated population. So in our methodology, we'll estimate this regression model where the outcome Y here is going to be earnings in most of our models of an individual I in quarter T. And then we'll have controls in there for the person over time, as well as effects that are happening across all people at any point in time. And then in the summation symbol, we'll estimate an effect of were you in the treatment area in 2005 for each quarter. So in each quarter, we're going to see how the difference in the treated and controlled population differs in that quarter, say like in 2006, compared to any differences between the treatment and control population at the time of the storm. And so we've already tried to make those differences between treated and control as minimal as possible using our matching set of control counties, but our estimation model will then show any remaining differences that appear over time that will attribute to the storm. So this is showing the treatment effects. The -8 through -2 in the left of the figure is showing what was happening for those differences prior to the storm. And so you can see there was not a significant difference in quarterly earnings for the treatment and control groups prior to the storm. After the storm, after that line, you see that initially the point estimate, the blue line, falls. There appears to be lower earnings of the treated individuals. But over time, it actually increases. So by about 3 years later, by about quarter 12 after the storm, the earnings of the treated individuals are actually higher than the control. And there's been another paper using tax data that found some similar results. So, this is pretty intriguing that this disaster could actually result in the population overall having higher earnings. So now we're going to, try and figure out why that's happening. So one of the first things we're going to do is look at decomposing those earning changes to changes in earnings within jobs and changes due to being non-employed. And so the purple line is the same line from the previous figure. The green line is showing earnings changes attributable to non-employment. And so you can see that right after the storm, there were some pretty significant drops in earnings, about $250 per quarter, on average, attributable to people becoming unemployed or non-employed. So, we know that's important. In the long run, though, the orange line corresponds pretty well with the total, and it looks like people who were employed were earning more in their jobs. So that makes us think that there might be some, changes not just in who is employed, but in how much they're earning in their job. So this is sort of these overall short-term and long-term effects. Short-term is in the year after the storm. Long-term is 7 years later. And so in the short term, on average, households were earning $298 less per quarter. In the long term, they were earning $792 more. Overall, it was $400 more. The numbers in brackets are percent change relative to their pre-storm earnings. So we'll do some breakdowns here by whether damage was by place of workplace and residence. So the major row under the residence damage shows the earnings change for households that had that really severe type of damage at their residence location, such as flooding or storm surge damage, and they were earning 17% less per quarter. That was a big hit. A lot of those households migrated, but even for those households, that change diminished quite a bit in the long run. Likewise, households whose workplace, where they were working at the time of the storm, was damaged, also had a really significant hit to earnings. This is just showing that graphically. So now I'm going to go into some of the industry level effects. So this is looking at the industry that someone was in before the storms hit. So for individuals who were working in the construction industry before the storms hit, they, even in the short term, had an increase in quarterly earnings. So the average construction worker had an increase of about $500 per quarter in the year after the storm. In the long term, that increased to over $2,000. And so that's one of the major outcomes that we're going to be investigating. In another set of industries, which we'll call the non-tradable industries, there were really significant losses for most of them in the short term. This is like leisure accommodations, like a tourism-intensive industry, healthcare, professional services, local services, which includes retail, like janitorial work, restaurants, and public sector and education is the last one. None of these did well in the short term. And even in the long run, these workers didn't have the same kinds of gains as the construction workers did, especially those in like healthcare industry. We're not seeing any long-term gain for them. Then individuals that were in tradable industries like agricultural resources, that includes petrochemical industry, manufacturing, trade, transportation, utilities. Those generally did not do well in the short term. We think there was a lot of physical damage, infrastructure damage that affected those businesses. They had a lot of layoffs, ceased operations in the short term. But in the long term, they actually did, pretty well relative to average. Just one more breakdown. If you look at individuals who were separated from their job immediately after the storm, a lot of the negative earnings effects were for those individuals who, were immediately separated. Individuals who maintained their job generally did not have short-term earning losses, but in the long run, they were both capable of having these kind of long-term earnings gains. So to try and understand what's happening in these local labor markets, we'll look at some data that's going to tell us a little bit about labor supply and labor demand, and there's more of this in the paper. So the first chart here shows population growth in the control and treatment areas. There's a drop in population in the treatment area relative to the control, and that never really rights itself all the way to 2012. That's attributable to households being evacuated and not returning. There's also a drop in employment growth in the treatment area, but that actually shows some convergence in the long run. Of course, we have a recession that it affects the whole country in 2008, 9, 10. It seems that the Gulf Coast area, that's a time when it actually really converged quite a bit with a lot of the rest of the country, and a time when there was a lot of rebuilding going on there, whereas a lot of the rest of the country was having a housing bust, things like that. So what's going on with wages at this time? That's going to tell us a little bit more about how supply and demand are changing. In the table at the bottom, we calculated wages, hourly wages, for the treatment and control areas in 2005, 2008, and 2012. And so the treatment area initially had lower wages, but it actually caught up quite a bit over that time period. And so we've estimated the changes in relative changes in wages for the treatment and control areas over that time period, and the treatment area caught up about had gains of about 6% relative to the control area over that time period. That actually corresponds fairly closely to the earnings estimates that we're finding from the individual level data. We find about an 8% earnings gain for the treated individuals. So this is an entirely different data set, but we're finding some similar trends at the local area, and so that's making us think that if you have a big demand increase in the location, that's going to be associated with wage gains as well as employment gains, which is what we saw overall for the treated population. So we see this increase, and the storm prompted over $100 billion in federal spending over 10 years. and billions more of insured property losses and flood insurance that went to the area. A lot of that went to rebuilding. So some of the sectors that we think are maybe most directly related to rebuilding, like construction, would have benefited from that. Construction sector had, those workers had a 23% increase in earnings in the long run. The non-tradable sectors that are really reliant on the size of the local population for their demand or on tourists visiting had some of the biggest decreases. The healthcare industry workers actually had a 2.2% decrease in earnings in the long run. So in conclusion, we find that the storms led to a net increase in earnings of affected individuals of about $404 per quarter. That's 4.1% over the whole time period. In the short term, in the first year, there were significant losses due to shifts to non-employment. But in the long run, we saw these increases that we attribute to increased earnings of people who had a job. And that's the measure that we corresponded with these wage figures that we looked at as well. Of course, we see a lot of dispersion. Households or individuals who had a lot of residential or workplace damage saw some of the biggest immediate negative hits to their earnings. And then short-term losses were really large, and the recovery was not as strong for those in like healthcare and leisure and accommodations industry, whereas those like construction industry and some of the sectors that followed up with a lot of demand as rebuilding started, as infrastructure got online, had significant gains. We look at some other individual characteristics in the paper, but we think these are some of the most significant outcomes, and happy to answer any questions about this. Our paper is published in the Journal of Labor Economics, and you can click on that link to get to it. Happy to answer any questions now.
Operator, we're ready to take questions over the phone.
Absolutely. If you would like to ask a question at this time, please press *1 on your phone, unmute your line, and record your name as it will be needed to introduce you. Again, to ask a question at this time, please press *1. It will take just a few moments for them to come through. Please stand by.
And while we wait for the questions to queue up on the phone, I'd like to remind everyone to please be courteous and keep your questions pertaining to the presentation with one follow-up question. We received a few questions regarding the presentation, which will be accessible on the Census Academy website in a week or two at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab. Also, an evaluation will be mailed to you following this webinar. We would appreciate if you took the time to fill this short survey out so that we may better serve you. So again, while we're waiting, there were a few questions that came in on the chat. This is a question from Lena, and she asked, did the disruption to public K-12 education and child care systems due to the hurricane impact the ability of workers with children to maintain employment and or work the same amount of hours post-disaster?
That's a really interesting question. So, first off, we saw workers who had been in the education industry prior to the storm had really significant drops in employment and earnings, and there were large layoffs in a lot of the affected jurisdictions due to budget shortfalls and due to the drop in population. It just didn't justify having as many, or they didn't decide to maintain as large of an education workforce. That's certainly a concern. I don't think we segmented our analysis by that household characteristic, whether the household had children. I think it probably would have been possible with our analysis. So, I wish I'd had your question a number of years ago when we were right in the middle of this. That certainly would have been something good to look at. I don't think that is something that we did. We did see in the paper, if you take a look at it, we have analysis by a lot of demographic characteristics that I didn't include here, including for women and men. A lot of those characteristics we didn't see as substantial differences as for these industry ones. But that's certainly something, that's interesting. I don't think I quite have the information to be able to answer that right now, though.
Okay. Another question was regarding your presentation, and Alexandra asked, will the data set you used to make the charts you presented along with the data behind the charts be available?
So the analysis, the paper and all of the code used to produce the analysis and the estimation results are all available on the Journal of Labor Economics website. They have a section, the link you can click on near the paper that takes you to basically appendix material for this paper that has a lot of those data that are reported in the paper. The underlying jobs data and the person, household, and worker data are not something that we can make available because that is data that's protected by the confidentiality rules of the Census Bureau. So we were able to do this analysis using that detailed data and review it with individuals trained in disclosure review, but we can't make that data directly publicly available. It is possible to use that data if you have authorization at the Census Bureau to use the data that was directly part of this analysis.
Okay, and let's check. Christine, are there any phone calls?
I'm not showing any questions at this time, but I will continue to monitor. Just a reminder, you may still press *1 to ask a question. Thank you.
Great. So I do have several questions in the chat. One of the questions is from your former colleague, Jim. He says, Mark, great presentation. Since you are following individuals you know who left New Orleans and never returned versus those who left New Orleans and came back, how do earnings differ for those two groups?
Let's see. So overall, the individuals who left New Orleans had really significant negative short-term effects compared to households that stayed in New Orleans or in the affected areas in general. We ended up not trying to figure out exactly what the effects were on individuals who returned versus those who stayed away, because we didn't have a good way of knowing why some individuals would return and why they wouldn't. I think we did find that the more significant the damage to a household's location, where they had lived, the less likely they were to return. But that might affect their outcomes, for a number of reasons. So, in the end, we felt that the best sort of causal analysis that we could be the most confident in for this study was to just look at to just compare people who were separated at the time of the storm, people who moved directly in response to the storm. We didn't look at return for this, but there's some other studies that do a good job of that. Jim, you've done some analysis of Hurricane Katrina, and but this study wasn't best positioned to be able to do that.
Okay.
Nice to hear
Another
from you.
question. Another question is from Ian. Recent research suggests that federal disaster relief efforts disproportionately benefit white individuals and households, who tend to see long-term increases in wealth over pre-disaster levels. The inverse is true for Black individuals and households, who receive less relief and remain worse off than before the disaster. Have you seen similarly racialized trends in short and long-term employment patterns?
So let's see. I didn't. I wonder if I have.
Mark?
Yeah. Are you still seeing the presentation, or?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I don't think I can pull up those. Well, maybe I can. No, I don't think I'm going to be able to pull them up right now. In the paper, there are results looking at differences by race ethnicity. We didn't find that the differences by race ethnicity were as substantial as the differences by, for example, the industry that households were in, or the amount of damage that occurred. Those seem to, have the most kind of predictive power on household outcomes. But of course, there's big differences in, in industry and where people live associated with their race and ethnicity. So, those are certainly tied together in a lot of ways. So, any persons who, live in places that are going to be more directly affected by storms, low-lying areas, or who work in industries that were more directly affected, would have had some more substantial negative outcomes.
Okay, Mark, and before I go on to the next question, I just wanted to let you know that your presentation is in that presenter mode, so that people could see your information.
Okay.
So I will go ahead and read the next question. This question comes from Mike. Similar question to one posed by another attendee. Is that underlying data, for example, LEHD with person IDs, available to other federal agencies for internal research purposes via MOU, various PII protections, ?
So the Census Bureau has a process for applying to do research using confidential data. I would refer you to the Federal Statistical Research Data Center website to understand the application process there. Basically, you have to define a research question and the data sets that you want to use, the types of analysis you want to produce, and then submit that for approval. But I don't have, more information on that process right now.
Mike says thank you. Another question is from Miriam. Any data analysis that you think can apply to COVID? Seems like seeing similar things now. The disaster has a pruning effect, and maybe everyone comes out stronger.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest takeaway from this research is that below the aggregate effect, there can be a big dispersion in outcomes across groups based on, who they are, what industry they were in, where they lived. Exactly what those factors are might vary quite a bit from one disaster to another. I know in the pandemic, some industries had, much more substantial layoffs, like, retail restaurants than others. I think like the finance industry had, less job loss. I think these overall effects are very, very relevant for understanding, how something might affect the economy overall. But if you really want to understand exactly what's happening in disaster, or some kind of shock to the economy, digging down to these different affected groups is really helpful for that. And that's what we tried to do in this analysis. In the paper in the appendix, you can see even more breakdown than what I presented here. In terms of was there sort of a pruning in the Gulf Coast area? Again, had there not been the kind of recovery spending that occurred in the Gulf Coast area, I think that demand shift that we think is responsible for the earnings gains in construction workers and other industries certainly would not have been as strong. And if reconstruction had been distributed differently, that might have had different effects as well. So there are some other analyses that try to look at whether the most productive businesses survived. If you look at the paper, you can see some citations for that. Overall, there was a lot of dislocation, and there were some who fared better and some who fared worse.
Okay, let me check with Christine. Are there any calls on the phone?
Yes, we do have one question from Michael. Go ahead, please. Your line is open.
I actually squeezed in my question via the chat as well, but thank you very much for the presentation. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I'm showing no further questions on the phone at this time, but you may still press *1.
Thank you, Christine. Here's another question. This is from Beth. In regards to long-term impact effects, a number of the comparable areas in hurricane zones, did you make any adjustments to account for control group participants, communities that might be affected by a subsequent disaster?
Trying to remember if we had any restrictions. So the way that we identified our control counties is we first of all, excluded any other counties in the 4 states that were directly affected by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. So, like, for example, Houston was, is in Texas. It was not directly affected by Hurricane Katrina or Rita, but it was really nearby, and there were a lot of evacuees from the Gulf Coast area that moved to Houston and may have affected the labor market there. And, for exactly that reason, we didn't want to include counties in those nearby areas, such as Houston, in our set of controls. So, we excluded the remainder of those 4 states. And I believe we excluded Florida from the controls because there were actually some effects from another hurricane, Wilma, I think, in the same year in Florida. But I think if you look at the map, you'll see that for the most part, there's all across the country, there were 28 states, I think, that had at least one county that was included in the control. So just for how we did that, we ran a propensity score model where we ran a logistic regression where the outcome was, were you in the treated area? And so the characteristics that best predicted that, we used those to score all of the, eligible counties in the U.S. And then we took the 5% of counties that, scored the highest in terms of, similarity to that Gulf Coast area. There certainly were, different kinds of dislocation effects around the country for various, economic disaster reasons. But they're pretty dispersed, our counties, and so, we don't think that any one or, small area of those counties would be, so substantially affected by some, other factor in the next 7 years that, they would, on their own create a difference from that Gulf Coast area and be sort of some, alternative, disaster outcome. So, we like to think of them as sort of representative of the national economy in terms of the characteristics of those Gulf Coast counties. So, we looked at that carefully. We were concerned that there might be, some county that, had some disaster that was a really large share of the control, but we don't think that was the case. So we think that the control is actually a pretty good kind of baseline of how the affected area might have fared had the storms not intervened.
Okay, and I have another question. Actually, it's Jim's question again. And he says, Mark, after an initial period of earnings losses, you're finding earnings gains in the long run of 7 years. What is the economic explanation for these long-run earnings gains? Is this a geographical explanation, parentheses, reduced labor supply and increased labor demand, parentheses, or something else?
Yeah, so that was that was the explanation that we thought best explained the results. That in the area directly affected by the storms, there was a big reduction in labor supply, followed by an overall increase in that area of labor demand, largely attributable to all the reconstruction spending. that's the kind of spending that didn't occur in other parts of the country. Other parts of the country had other kinds of economic dislocation during the Great Recession at that time. But New Orleans was still, the Gulf area was still rebuilding then. So, what you would expect to see if you had both of those, reduction in labor supply, increase in labor demand, would be higher wages. And so, we find two pieces of evidence of that, or really three I'll go over. The first is in our earnings estimates, we find that people maintaining a job from one quarter to another had higher earnings. So it wasn't just that people were more likely to be employed in the long run, it was that they were more likely to earn more in their job. Second, we used data from BLS and found that wages actually increase in the treatment area relative to the control area over time, hourly wages. And third, we actually broke down those wage increases by industry, and we compared those wage change results by industry with our earnings change results by industry. And we actually found a pretty good correspondence that the industries where we were seeing high wage gains also had within job earnings gains. And we looked at those industry by industry and found that there seemed to be changes in supply and demand that were consistent with that. So for example, like I mentioned, in education, there was a lot of school closings, a lot of layoffs in schools because that's the industry that serves the local population, which was reduced. And in the healthcare industry, there was actually like a reduction in the number of beds available in hospitals. In the tourism industry, there were fewer flights into the area. We tried to look industry by industry and see what was going on, and it seemed like overall there was sort of a local supply and demand story going on. Now, there's also the evacuees, and we're still thinking about them in terms of the industry that they were in before the storm. Some of them went to labor markets all over the country, that were experiencing different things, and so the local labor market outcomes or the local labor market dynamics for the population we're looking at, these affected individuals, is a bit of a complex story, and we tried to address it most directly for the local labor market of the Gulf Coast area, which is where the majority of them, the vast majority, did stay. But there's other groups that went to other places, like Houston, for example, where there may have actually been an increase in labor supply. This is a complex story, but we think that overall in the affected area, there were changes in supply and demand that resulted in higher wages overall, and especially for the industries that had the biggest drops in labor supply or biggest increases in labor demand.
Okay, so just one more check. Christine, are there any questions on the phone?
I'm showing no further questions at this time.
Great. And there are no further questions in the chat. So at this time, I'll just go ahead and close this out. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon.
And can I just say I want to acknowledge my thanks to a lot of people at the Census Bureau for their help during this project in terms of understanding data sets and understanding some of the economics involved. And so we're indebted to a lot of support from colleagues. At Census Bureau, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and elsewhere in terms of feedback and developing this paper.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Mark for his excellent presentation. The LED webinar will continue again on July 21st, 2021 at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time when Chris Worley presents spatial shift during daytime population. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for spending the afternoon with us. Have a wonderful day.